let me go ahead and skip to the second slide if that's all right. All right, so I'm going to ask folks who are in the chat, who are these folks that are pictured here? If you have access to the chat, go ahead and throw in some names. Who are we looking at here? All right, I see Ana Sarai has answered one. Does anybody else know? Okay, Anna, thank you, thank you. All right. Great. So some folks know the folks that are in these photos. What do these two folks have in common? Go ahead and let me know in the chat again. What do they have in common? They are public figures, and they are both immigrants, and they also have money. Yes. Yeah. So again, I think that the quick takeaway here is that we have folks that represent the American dream, that are, again, in my mind, Americans, but in the minds of others, maybe not. So let's jump into this. Can I see the next slide, please? I think I lost a few of my quotes here. All right. Well, there are three quotes that are supposed to be on this slide. One is from President Kennedy, one is from Governor Cuomo, and one is from Ronald Reagan. And I will make sure you guys get the corrected deck. But there are three quotes about essentially immigration, right? So there's Senator Kennedy in 1954 gave a speech at a naturalization ceremony in which he said there is no distinction made between native-born and naturalized citizens, and no limitation is placed upon the distance between what your talents and abilities are and where they can take you, right? So real setup. Governor Cuomo said famously, I learned about our kind of democracy from my father, and he describes his father as someone who came here uneducated, alone, and unable to speak the language, right? And then President Reagan, in his last address to the country, said, you can go and live in France, but you cannot become a Frenchman. You can go live in Germany or Turkey or Japan, but you cannot become a German, a Turk, or Japanese. But anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in the United States and become an American, right? So there was a time in which whatever the reality was in terms of folks' experiences with the immigration system, at least folks were speaking about immigration, immigrants, and again, the arc that folks had in the American dream in a very positive light. Can I see the next slide, please? Oh, this is what happened. Can I skip to the next one after this one? There we go. All right, so let's look at the two sort of bookends we have here. On the left, the bookend is Arnold Schwarzenegger, who, does anyone know who Arnold Schwarzenegger is? Remember Arnold Schwarzenegger? If you're in the chat. So tell me something about Arnold Schwarzenegger in the chat. He's the Terminator, and he's a politician. Yes, he went on to become governor of California. He married a Kennedy, right? So he became like this sort of superstar status symbol of the American dream. He was famously a Republican, who, again, was supposed to represent this new face of republicanism, right? And he, in 2004, was championing a campaign in which the U.S. Constitution should be amended so that naturalized citizens could become presidents of the United States. This is something that was not, again, the Constitution currently says you have to be a native-born citizen to become president. He wanted to change that, and there was a lot of support for that at the time. 20 years later, on the right-hand side, there's a New York Times article about our current president. What do we know about our current president in terms of his views towards immigration, immigrants? Well, we can't sugarcoat this. They're pretty awful, right? They're dehumanizing. It's a person who has made his career essentially trying to question the citizenship of another president, right? Like Donald Trump was a champion of the birther conspiracy theory around Barack Obama, that his birth certificate was fake, that he was not born in the United States. So you can see that in the span of one generation, there's a severe shift. there's a severe shift in terms of the public rhetoric. So again, like the realities around immigration have always been more complicated than the rhetoric. The experiences of immigrants have always been more complicated than the rhetoric. But the shift in the rhetoric itself, I think, is an important place for us to start our conversation today. So let's skip to the next slide, please. And again, this is the punchline. We're giving away the ending. There is no post-racial America. And what that means in terms of immigration and immigrants, immigration enforcement, is that there is no separating the immigrant experience from the racialization of America, right? So all of the things that we've heard today, again, if we were to go back to the beginning of today's presentation and talk about how someone's race, their zip code, their economic status, all of these things have been coded, they've been racialized, and that is not a new thing. That is, again, part of a very long legacy. The same is true with immigration. Let's go to the next slide, please. So, just a few quick signposts in terms of history. The very first thing that happens in this country, and so again, we have 1776, we have the Declaration of Independence, 1787, we have a constitution, and then they make a decision about who is a citizen, right? So unsurprisingly, white male property holders decided that only white people could be citizens, right? So again, think about the fact that you learned that there were folks who were Black soldiers, Native American soldiers who were fighting, again, in these early wars for colonial control, for power, for freedom, for independence. Think about all the Hollywood movies you've seen. Like there was very famously one with like Heath Ledger and like Mel Gibson, where like everyone is fighting together alongside. Well, the sort of the dirty thing that happens is that basically like all of those things happen, but people are excluded. And not only are people excluded, then they're aggressively targeted. So then the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 becomes a really important piece of, I think, orientation around the idea of like how folks are othered around race and immigration. So the Chinese Exclusion Act is meant to be a prohibition of immigrants coming in from China. But those of us who know about the 14th Amendment, in 2 weeks, the 14th Amendment will be argued before the Supreme Court because, again, the current president of the United States has argued that birthright citizenship should be overturned. Birthright citizenship has stood since a decision that was based around the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? There is an American gentleman of Chinese descent who was almost denied his citizenship, almost denied his right to be and live and thrive in the United States because of his race. And the Supreme Court, again, for all its problematic history, did at this point in time, in the 19th century, realize, well, what it says on paper here is that someone, again, according to the 14th Amendment, is that any person who was born here is a citizen. And it doesn't have any asterisks, it doesn't have any qualifiers. So we have to honor that. So what does the government then do, again, in reaction to this? Well, again, if we have to honor the fact that everyone who's born here is going to be a citizen, well, then we need to prevent certain people from being born here so that we can prevent them from having citizenship. And that is what we see with the Chinese Exclusion Act that lasts all the way until World War II, right? And that is what we see with, like, again, the national origins quota and other, again, pieces of legislation that come from the Know-Nothing era that, like, continue on into the Great Depression, when there's this huge repatriation of Mexicans and Mexican Americans based on racial profiling, right? Like nobody was checking anyone's papers. No one was running them through, a process by which like there was a sort of fair and measured due process, a legal process for folks to go over their citizenship. That people were just, again, by sight, racially profiled, identified, and then action was taken. So let's take a look at the next slide. This idea of legality and illegality around immigration really becomes hardened, not only as a result of like, again, rates of migration, but literally in some ways it is formulated around Black and brown identity, right? So again, what we see in 1965, which is a time of incredible progress, right? Like if you think about like 1965 is we have a Voting Rights Act. 1965 is when we have, again, for the educators, this is our biggest piece of public education legislation in the United States history, really empowering in 1965 an overhaul of public education K through 12. And then it also creates a lot of opportunity for immigrants. But there is a poison pill. The poison pill that's inserted in 1965 is we have to put quotas on people coming from the Western Hemisphere. And they weren't really concerned about people from all of the Western Hemisphere, right? They weren't really thinking about Canada. They weren't saying like, oh, we really need to keep the Canadians out. They were thinking about specifically Mexicans, but writ large, Latinos and Caribbean folks, right? They wanted to control migration from within the Western Hemisphere. So again, like a little bit of U.S. history, like if you think about the Monroe Doctrine, and you think about Manifest Destiny, and you think about the fact that like the empire and the colony had really claimed everything in the Western Hemisphere as being under the control of the United States, folks were well aware of that history, and they were like, let's not leave an open door for folks to come in. But they left an open door for folks to come in because they needed workers. And so again, like the same group of folks that had kicked out Mexican Americans, on the onset of the Great Depression, as part of like the Great Repatriation, they welcomed everybody in. So the Bracero program, which many of you are likely familiar with, my family participated in the Bracero program. Lots of folks came because workers were needed. So you see mass migration of workers coming in. And so there's this sort of sick pattern that happens, right? Where like people are welcomed in en masse to full jobs. And as soon as they need a scapegoat, they are scapegoated again. So then in the 1950s, the again, Operation Wetback in 1954, which is literally the name it was given, mass expulsion of people. So again, mass invitation, mass expulsion, mass invitation, mass expulsion. And again, the sort of takeaway lesson from this period is that immigration enforcement is very little to do with actual immigration law and much more to do with racial perception. And the racialized identity that people hold as immigrants, again, largely around this idea of legality and illegality. So let me just sort of like ask a quick question of folks in the chat. Who has heard of the green card lottery? If you've heard about it, put it in the chat. Have you heard of the green card lottery? All right. So a couple yeses. Great. So there are countries that famously cannot participate in the green card lottery. And as you might guess, those countries are the ones that have the longest immigration backlog. So without exaggeration, without hyperbole, if you are a high school dropout in Belgium and you have never done anything in your life or proven yourself in any way, shape, or form, you can enter a green card lottery and win permanent residency in the United States. If you win permanent residency in the United States through the green card lottery, how many years do you think it would take for you to bring in a spouse or bring in a child and have them also have then full conferred status that would allow them to move towards citizenship? How many years do you think that is, folks in the chat? How many years? It's a good guess from Rita. Anyone else a good guess? So it's 3 to 5 years. 3 years, basically. What about if you are from Mexico and you are not allowed to enter the green card lottery? Let's assume that you are fortunate enough to get into a line and fortunate enough to get into a process of, again, getting a green card. If you were to lock into that permanent residency lane and you wanted to start the process of reunifying with, again, a child or a spouse, how long is the wait for that for someone born in Mexico? Yeah, Luis is right. It's 24 years. And it was 24 years before the Trump administration took power in 2025. So it is even more chaotic and horrible than that now. So imagine kissing your wife goodbye or kissing your son or daughter goodbye and telling them you're going to see them in 24 years. So the reason that this is that the immigration laws, again, there's not one line that everyone can get into. There is not one process that everyone can go through. This is not the DMV. There are actually dozens and dozens and dozens of visa types, 87 currently visas that folks can apply to. You can only apply to them from outside of the country and not within the country, which means that if you enter the country under one kind of visa, it's hard for you to move to a different kind of visa. And again, you have to imagine all of these changes, these laws and these decisions as things that impact people who are still waiting in line. So very famously, to use the example of the 1980s, the 1986, there was a law called IRCA that was passed, half of the people that applied for IRCA were granted a pathway forward to green cards and citizenship. Half of the people that applied for it did not get it. And there was an assumption that people were going to leave because they didn't get IRCA, but they didn't leave. They stayed. And so then the laws changed. IRCA then became a series of laws that changed employment in the United States and created penalties for folks hiring people that did not have work permissions or work permits to work in the United States. Then another series of laws come in, right? Here I point to the 1996 law, because the 1996 law that criminalizes people for their status comes at the same time as like 3 strikes and you're out come into play. So again, there is a deep relationship between things that are meant to punish people on the basis of race, to terrorize people on their perpetual othering on the basis of race, and like the status of immigrants, right? So all of these things are moving along, again, in concurrence. So again, if you're stuck in line in 1986, you continue to be in line in 1996, but the laws have changed. And then in 2001, when 9/11 happens, the laws change again. So you have not changed. The laws have changed around you, and the wait time has not lessened for you. So again, if you are a Mexican immigrant who is now in line for a green card and you have this 24-year waiting period, think about the number of laws that have changed in those 24 years and how then the doors have been closed to you, the options have been closed to you along the way. Next slide, please. All right, so the question here is like, what is the American dream and do you need to be a citizen to claim it, right? So we'll skip through this because we talked a little bit about this with the first slide, right? So when we talk about the American dream, it's also like who is excluded from the American dream, right? So there's 2 slides here. This is sort of like, again, the picture of the American dream being a working class dream, but we know that the reality is that the American dream is about exclusion of the American dream on the basis of race. How do we challenge this, right? How have we challenged this? Well, we've challenged this collectively. We've challenged this collectively through our movement. So if we go to the next slide, I think there's a very clear indicator here from Dr. Martin Luther King on the 4th of July in 1965, right? And the part of this quote that I want to point to is, somebody else will have to go to jail. Maybe some will have to face physical death before victory is won, right? Some will be misunderstood, called bad names, and dismissed as dangerous, rabble-rousers, and agitators. This feels particularly important to spell out because, again, a lot of our conversations around immigration have very poor frames, right? So we heard right before this presentation from the way that we talk about folks, meeting them with values, having a heart-to-heart, like getting in the car of somebody that has guns and scary bumper stickers and trying to connect with them on a human level. There's a really good, important lesson there and the wise path forward. But we also have to name the reality that there are bad laws that are broken and do not work. And sort of to speak in defense of those laws is problematic, right? And that is a lot of the problems that we have with immigration. We have been stuck in this loop where the way that politicians have started to talk about immigration has been to follow the laws, to get in the line, even though we know that these laws are different laws for different people based on the country that they come from, based for when they entered the country, right? And that the laws are not serving anyone's benefit, right? So they are not obviously Jim Crow laws. They are not the Chinese Exclusion Act. They are not, as disgusting as America's racial past. But they are serving some of those same functions in the way that they are enforced and the way that people are living them. So again, if we skip ahead to the next slide. So again, like this, really what's on the line here is this idea of a path to Americanism, right? Giannis, who was in the picture, a great, incredible basketball player. Like, I think he's the best in the NBA right now. He famously was the subject of a lot of rumors, a few weeks back, right? Like potential trade window. Would he leave the Bucks and go to another team? And like, what would you need to trade to get Giannis, right? Like, there's this highly coveted thing around him being really exceptional. And he said the reason why he didn't want to leave his community is because his father is buried there, right? So technically, this is someone who's not a US citizen, somebody who holds a green card, but he already feels that he's not only American, but connected to a community and connected to the trajectory of a people. That is a very quintessentially positive definition of immigration, of Americanism, and of systems. And we have seen it before, right? We saw it from Reagan, we saw it from Kennedy, we saw it from Cuomo, we've seen it from historians like Philip Gleason. And that stands in stark contrast with what we're seeing from folks like J.D. Vance, who tells us that America is not an idea, it is a particular place with a particular people, and that it means heritage, right? So all of these very dangerous, scary dog whistles that are built around, white supremacy, Christian white nationalism, all of these very scary moments that we're in right now. Let's go to the next slide. And so this is really the most important thing. Progress for immigrants and immigration is going to be inextricably connected with Black and Native liberation. And that's because immigration enforcement actually doesn't follow immigration realities, right? 90% of people detained, arrested, or deported in 2025 were Latino, and yet almost 80% of Latinos are US citizens, right? So again, citizenship itself is not the issue. Despite the broken system, despite the way that things have been set up, despite the fact that we need to overhaul all of these things, immigration enforcement primarily runs around racial profiling. And because it primarily runs around racial profiling, and because the Supreme Court said it can continue to do this, that is the reality in which folks are experiencing this, right? So there is a true group of folks who are facing a broken immigration system, who are trying to navigate to try to create paths forward because none exist, right? Very famously, folks who have DACA have no path forward, right? Their future will be decided by a court case, but they have no path forward. There's no line they can get into from inside the United States that allows them a path forward. They have essentially a temporary protection against detention and deportation, and we've already seen that unravel and fall apart. I will sort of just kind of skip through very quickly. The last couple of slides, I talk about, again, the history of intersectional movements that we have. Again, famously, abolition, suffragism were at their strongest when they were intersectional. We can skip to the next slide. And then again, talking about how we build around collective stories, narratives, and storytelling. And there's several slides here, which I will just let's go ahead and skip through these slides. And let's stop at the slide 18, or the slide that has Barack Obama. Yeah. So again, I think that the thing that I will leave here as a 30-second takeaway lesson is an individual story has its good, its bad, and its relatability or non-relatability. But the way that the individual stories connect together to create an arc are the things that create the most powerful movements that have allowed us to win progress. The civil rights movement, as a series of individual stories, is incredibly tragic. When you're trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge and you see people like John Lewis beat within an inch of their lives, that's horrifying. When you talk about freedom riders meeting death because they're registering people to vote, that is horrifying. When you think about 4 little girls that lost their lives in a church bombing, that is horrifying. When you think about the assassination of our leaders, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, that is horrifying. But collectively, all of the stories together pull us into our best version of ourselves and bring us forward as we begin to arc a narrative for who we are and where we're going. And we have to invite ourselves to do that again, to build a bigger narrative, a bigger we, that pulls us all forward, knowing that winning progress for immigrants is actually winning progress for all folks. And this collective liberation, this story of who we are and where we're going, is really the most important thing. So that's the last slide that I have, and I will leave it there because I know we're at time.